One of the most important lessons in my life is that almost everything I was brought up to believe turns out to be untrue. Now, I don't blame my parents for this. In fact, I don't blame anyone for this. They, just like everybody else, was brought up with the same founding, justifying, centralizing myths. All classes have them, all groups of people subscribe to them, and they're always wrong.
We do not choose to exist. We do not choose what environment we will grow up in. The people we become, the lives that we lead, the beliefs and values we learn to hold, owe much to the lottery of our birth. Our starting point in life is one of reliance on forces over which we have no control. Long before we can shape the world has firmly shaped us. But what we are shaped into is no accident. For though our entry into this world is arbitrary, the world that greets us is not.
We've evolved, first of all, to pay attention to our parents and pretty much to believe whatever they tell us the first few years of our lives.
We're all born almost fully fledged as citizens, as members of a particular class, citizens of a particular country, believing that that's the only way it can be and the only way it will always be. But of course, the context into which we are born is one which has been highly engineered by particular political and economic forces.
The environment we grow up in provides us with its own picture of reality. A set of beliefs and values, prejudices and biases tied to particular symbols and particular labels. While they may link us with some, they can separate us from many more. And so completely do we learn to identify with these symbols and labels, some of us will kill or die for them.
I think by our very nature, we're apt to be less skeptical than we ought to be. We tend to accept the background assumptions, the values of the culture that we're born into. People like to believe things that put them or the group they belong to in a good light. Everyone thinks they're on the side of the angels. Realizing that you are apt to think better of yourself and your gender and your religion and nation than you ought to is the first step towards getting an objective assessment of what you and your group are like.
One of the things that most effectively blinds us to our own role in the world and to our examining our own beliefs and our own actions is patriotism, or indeed adherence to any pre-established view of the world. But patriotism has a particularly effective role in preventing us from knowing ourselves, because you begin with the assumption that you are the best and most desirable country in the world. That's the central assumption of patriotism. Of course, it can't be true in all cases. It's probably not true in any cases. But it allows you not to see the bad things your country is doing and not to see the impacts that it exerts on other people. Patriotism is always conceived as a virtue, and as a result, it's a particularly powerful force in blinding us to certain realities.
Imagine two enemies on a battlefield. Suppose it were possible to go back in time and swap them at birth, so that each child would be raised in the other's culture. In time, would each not end up fighting for the other side? A different flag, a different religion, a different ideology?
I think it's a source of great tragedy that we're apt to believe our own self-serving story, to sincerely believe that we are seeing the world as it is and that other people are deluded or dishonest or impervious to reason. And you can have two people sincerely believing opposing views about themselves and the other side.
I think the reflection on the conditions that control you in order to be free to act as an autonomous agent, a sovereign agent, with as deep a knowledge about the world in which you are, is absolutely vital. But this self-reflection cannot come from within the chains of control that bind you, that lock you in. Therefore, you need an opening. And an opening can only come through experience of relationship. It could be relationship with nature, it could be relationship with other cultures, but it is relationship outside the box which locks you in.
We come into this world with the potential for a wide range of behavior. Much depends on the soil in which we grow. The difference between the towering tree and the decaying seed may be no more than environmental. History suggests that there is neither a belief too bizarre nor an action too appalling for humans to embrace, given the necessary cultural influences. This idea, though simple, has profound implications for our personal and political freedom. In an important sense, we are not born free. In fact, to take our freedom for granted is to extinguish the possibility of attaining it.
If you have a society, it's going to have certain roles and certain positions available. That's just inevitably the case. That'll be true forever, as long as we have societies. So education you can view in one of two ways. You can say education is this process by which people arrive at the capacity to utilize their skills and talents maximally and to enrich their lives and so on. A positive view of education. Alternatively, you can say education is a process which prepares people to fit positions in society. It gives them the information and the attitudes, the personalities, the inclinations, the expectations that are consistent with the positions that they're going to fill in society. Now, actually, the second is inevitable. but you want the first. So to have the first, it must be that the positions that people are going to have in society need for people to be their most fulfilled and accomplished and capable selves. But that's not the case for typical societal structures that we now have. So the school system has to teach you to endure boredom. It has to teach you to take orders and to obey. And so that's what it does for 80%. So there's a contradiction between fitting the slot and being the best you can be, so to speak. To have good education, to have liberating education, society has to have slots that are for free people, that are for initiating and caring human beings.
Systems of education must prioritize certain ideas, facts, and behavior over others. These priorities tell us much about the dominant values and goals of a society.
In the United States, every student learns about the Boston Massacre. 5 people were killed in the Boston Massacre. They do not learn about the massacre in the 1860s in Colorado, where hundreds of Indians were killed by an American Army regiment. As soon as I began to study history, I realized that the history that was given to me was a history determined by the historian. The lectures that were given to me in class were lectures whose content was decided by the teacher. And so I came to the conclusion that the important distortions in history come not from lying, that is, not from telling falsehoods about history. The important distortions come from what is omitted from history, comes from the process of selection, in which certain things are selected because they're palatable, because they're useful for the selector, and other things, because they might cause trouble, are not selected. So I decided very soon in my own work in history that I would recognize this fact. I would not disguise whatever history I was doing and make people think that I was giving them objective, neutral history. Inevitably, the history I present would be my point of view. And therefore, I wanted my readers, just as I wanted my students when I was teaching history, I wanted them to know my work was biased against racism, against war, against economic exploitation. This is my point of view. I have decided that this is the important thing to tell you. You should know that this is not objective. This is partial. The Columbus story has been presented for generations to young Americans in school as a story of adventure, nobility, courage. Columbus, the great hero, because he very bravely crossed the ocean and found this land in the Western Hemisphere. In fact, so many things in the United States are named after Columbus. There are many cities, and there's Columbia University. There are statues of Columbus in various parts of the country. What is not told to young people in school is that Columbus was a predator. His main goal was, well, the main goal of expansionists anywhere, to move into another territory and to seize the riches of that territory. And in the search for gold, he subjected the Indians that he met in the Bahamas to terrible cruelties. He mutilated Indians. He killed them and kidnapped them. These indigenous people actually lived in a very benign society and reacted to the coming of Columbus with generosity, bringing gifts and so on. That side of the Columbus story is not told at all. And there's a reason for that, because if it were told in its truth, then it might make young people question.
How many American students are taught that between 1945 and 2005, the United States attempted to overthrow 50 governments around the world, many of them democracies?
If you talk about atrocities committed in the colonial period by the British Empire, most people will just stare at you blankly. They have no idea what you're talking about. If you talk about Stalin's atrocities, they're fully apprised of those. But Lord Lytton's in India probably killed as many people as Stalin did by very similar methods, exporting grain in the midst of a famine. Huge quantities of grain, often from places where there was a surplus of production, very successful harvests, and engineered a famine in which tens of millions of people died. But we hear nothing of this. We know nothing of this.
How many British students learn about the work of the historian Mark Curtis? Drawing on formerly secret UK government files, he estimates that Britain is complicit in the deaths of over 10 million people from countries around the world since 1945.
Schooling can't be politically neutral because it's preparing people to play a role in society. And roles in society are not politically neutral because they affect the distribution of power. It's either preparing you to empower those who already have power by increasing their authority, increasing the distribution of their ideas, or by increasing their wealth. If you're trained to serve them, then you've been trained to play a political role. If you're trained to pursue your own vision, to develop your own vision first and then pursue it, then that's a political role also.
In the 1960s in the United States, there was, of course, like most places in the world, an upheaval, a gigantic social upheaval of resistance and opposition to the past, to the structures of capital and power that existed in society. The government, of course, the elites confronted a problem. They didn't want this to recur.
In 1973, at the behest of billionaire David Rockefeller, an organization known as the Trilateral Commission was founded. Its early members were drawn from the United States, Western Europe, and Japan. Among them were the heads of major corporations, banks, law firms, and government. Concerned about the resistance of the 60s, the Commission set out to investigate its root causes. Their report was entitled The Crisis of Democracy.
And this commission did an investigation focusing on education and on school systems because, of course, so much of the activity occurred on campuses. And they actually came up with a conclusion. It wasn't the totality of the reasons for the 60s, but it's quite revealing, and it was one of the reasons. What they said was the population was being overeducated. That's an incredible kind of idea, and yet it's accurate. They were saying, and they were very clear on this, that we were educating people enough so that they actually expected to have a life, so that they expected to have a degree of control when they got finished with their educations. And what they were encountering was their ability to control their own lives was marginal, and people resisted. And what they decided was that they had to make a change in the educational system. They had to cut back on the high-quality education that they had until then, under the pressure of Sputnik and the rest, been spreading through society, and instead increase the more regimented education.
The report regarded the education system as the most important value-producing system in society, and argued that a program is necessary to lower the job expectation of those who receive a college education. Within 2 years of the report's publication, all of the top positions in the US government, the Office of President, Vice President, Secretary of State, Defense, and Treasury were held by members of the Trilateral Commission, and the National Security Advisor was its director.
Education quite clearly replicates control in many, many ways. I come from a country that was colonized by Britain, and one of the instruments of control was education, because education can either free the mind and encourage independent thinking, or it can control the mind and condition the mind and basically turn you into slaves who voluntarily give up their freedom because they don't know how else to be, how else to think.
An education that omits what's needed to understand power thereby protects it. Most of us will pass through school without a single lesson on the roots of inequality, the influence of corporations, or the workings of capitalism. By rewarding certain attitudes, abilities, and behavior, while punishing others, schooling discourages deviation from its prescribed path. Our world is transformed by the work that we do. But most of us have very little control over the aims, conditions, and availability of this work. When employed, we use our time and creativity to serve agendas set by others.
The decisions that professionals make in their work has much, much more influence on society than the way they vote every 4 years in the voting booth. If you look at people's lives, you'll see that their work really is their most important project. You rarely find a project on which people spend 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, minimum actually. You're selling the best hours of your life. You're selling the biggest project in your life. You're selling your biggest interaction with society. Professionals are deliberately produced to be intellectually and politically subordinate. The distinguishing feature is their willingness and ability to maintain ideological discipline in their work. Yes, they are skilled, but a lot of non-professionals are skilled too. The work of a non-professional can be and is specified in a manual. The manual shows what to do in all the possible situations that come up. Whereas professional work has no manual. Professional work is creative in that sense. A journalist, for example, there's no manual that tells a journalist even what the first word of a story should be. Employers assign the ideology to the professional, and then the professional goes about creative work under the guidance of that assigned ideology. So professionals are doing creative work under a framework that's dictated by their employers. Teachers, for example, get awards for finding new and innovative ways of conveying the curriculum to the students. But the curriculum is dictated by the employers. So they're doing creative work, but they have been stripped of political control of that work. The journalist's angle on a story, the historian's depiction of events, the accountant's bookkeeping decision, the language that the lawyer uses in a contract or in an argument, the minister's sermon, the teacher's lesson, even the speechwriter's joke tilts one way or the other, and the way it tilts is never an accident.
In any profession, once you actually become involved in doing it, and if you want to do it, it's terribly easy to get caught up with the natural everyday logic of pragmatically doing the job, and you fail to stand back and look at the context within which you're doing it. I came up through tabloid newspapers. I was taught to select stories and angle stories and to write stories with a view to selling the paper. I took that for granted. I thought that's what journalism was about. And I think it was years of working without thinking before I stepped back and thought, well, hang on a moment. I'm supposed to be a journalist, not a salesman. And if I make these crucial decisions about what story subject to cover and with what angle and at what length and on what page and with what language, if I make those kind of decisions on commercial grounds, I'm out of step with the kind of journalistic judgments that I should be making. And those journalistic judgments really aren't commercial, they're moral judgments. But I'd been doing the job for years before I really thought that through.
In the course of my research for Disciplined Minds, I came across a newsletter from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which is one of the 2 nuclear weapons design laboratories in the United States. The interviewer asked some young nuclear weapons designers, what is the worst thing about your job? And these young guys paused to think, and they thought, and finally they said things like, oh, the computers, they don't have enough capacity and they're always going down. Things like that, very narrow. To me, this was a great illustration of the subordination of professionals. It wasn't their job or even their interest to question the big picture, to wonder, maybe the worst thing about my job is that I'm making the world a more dangerous place, that I'm setting up disaster by designing weapons of mass destruction. They didn't comment on that at all. In general, questioning the goal of the work is not considered to be a legitimate part of the work assignment. People are not supposed to question the moral work of their employers.
As a young child, I knew I wanted to be a physicist. Einstein was my inspiration. And in those days of the 70s, the highest level of physics was to join the nuclear establishment, which is exactly what I was training for. And I was spending my summers in the Bhabha Atomic Research Center and feeling very smug, feeling very cool about what I was doing. I was the first woman in the fast breeder reactor when it was going critical. And I came home and with excitement was sharing this with my family. And my sister, who was at that time training to be a medical doctor, just asked me a very simple question. And what about the radiations? And started to talk to me about what nuclear radiation does to the human body. And I realized in that moment that I had learned the best of nuclear physics, but not one class had I been taught on nuclear radiation and its hazards. And that's the day I decided that I didn't want to learn a one-sided science. I wanted to learn the whole. I wanted to have a holistic idea of what I was studying, and that's what shifted me to theoretical physics and the study of the foundations of quantum theory. But that's the wake-up moment for me to know that there is a very partial window that is opened for you. And that partial window numbs you to the impact of your actions. And so often, the best of scientists have absolutely no idea what their actions are doing. It applies to today's biotechnologists and genetic engineers. They feel so happy that they now can move genes across species barriers, but they have the worldview of a Petri dish. All they can see is these cells in the Petri dish. They have no experience of a real plant. They have no experience of real soil. And they have no relationship with real farmers whose lives they are destroying.
Citizens in a democratic society enjoy the freedoms of speech, privacy, and association. The freedom to vote out leaders they do not like and elect ones they do. But employees seldom enjoy these freedoms. Instead, they are subject to a strict chain of command and close monitoring. To enter the workplace, the rights of the citizen must often be left behind.
Well, in the economy, there's no democracy at all. There's not even anything that can remotely be described as democratic. Rather, in a typical corporation, the owners, the people at the top of the corporate hierarchy, make the decisions, and their will is law. Stalin never dreamed of telling people when they could go to the bathroom. Owners of companies routinely lay down laws and rules about how often or when you can go to the bathroom. Owners have a level of intrusive control over the daily life situation of people in the economy that is just incredible. You're basically just following dictates and structures that are imposed by others, doing work in which you have almost no say over what you're doing, over any of the circumstances or conditions of what you're doing. So in that domain, in the economic domain, the discussion can't be about that. If it's about that, if there's really an honest discussion about the amount of say everybody has and the level of democracy, well, then the whole thing is corrupt and would have to be thrown out.
The system of education and employment doesn't require you to internalize its ideology. It just requires you to maintain ideological discipline. In other words, in your work, you abide by the ideology of the employer. All day long at work, you could be writing advertising copy, praising a product, and then after work, you could tell all your friends that it's a piece of junk. Don't buy it. However, this doesn't happen very often. You may have heard of the Stockholm Syndrome. It's a name that comes from an incident that happened in Sweden where a bank robber took a bunch of people hostage and held them for a long time. When they were finally released, the former hostages spoke very favorably about the person who had held them at gunpoint under threat of killing them. People found that very peculiar. Well, it's simple psychology that it's safer to take that position. These people maximize their chance of not being killed by becoming sympathetic to the person who had the life and death power over them. Well, the same thing happens in the workplace. The safest way to survive in the workplace is to internalize that ideology.
Well, in life, what happens, you realize you have to, if you want to survive, you have to fit in with the structure as it is. If you want a job, you have to please the person who employs you. If you want to get on, you've got to give people confidence that you are not going to disturb their lives in any way. And so the structure as it is becomes more attractive to you.
Ideological conformity is often seen as politically neutral because it's so common. If somebody is not conforming to the dominant ideology, that dictated by the employer, then people say, well, that person is getting political, as if that person wasn't political all along, serving the employer's ideology. So, yeah, it's kind of insidious when people who are working day and night to support the status quo are seen as non-political.
A hierarchically structured workplace demands that we sell more than our time and knowledge. It demands that we sell our obedience. The more skillfully we conform to the logic of the system and obey the agendas of those above us, the more power we will attain. Throughout life, people are trained to obey parents, teachers, and employers, to obey the laws of society's gods and governments. This obedience pushes power up the social hierarchy. More power is concentrated in fewer hands. The worst crimes in history would not have been possible without mass obedience and conformity to the demands of power. From the policeman, scientist, and soldier to the journalist, lawyer, and intellectual. In July 1961, Professor of Social Psychology Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments at Yale University to investigate people's responses to a recognized authority. The initial motivation for the experiment was to understand how German citizens were able to carry out the crimes of the Holocaust during World War II. The original experiments were filmed. Two people come to a psychology laboratory in a prestigious university. One of them is designated teacher, the other learner. The experimenter explains that the study is concerned with the effects of punishment on memory and learning.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Learner. Teacher. Now, your job is to remember which one of these four other words was originally paired with blue. And you indicate your answer by pressing one of these four switches. Now, can you reach those all right? Now, if you get it correct, fine. If you make an error, however, you'll be punished with an electric shock.
Though the teacher does not know it, the learner is in fact an actor and will only pretend to receive shocks.
Now, each time he gives a wrong answer, you move up one switch on the shock generator. And, of course, we'll begin with 15 volts for the first wrong answer. Okay? Do not begin until I say, ready, begin, please. Attention, learner. Your teacher is about to begin the test. Try and remember the word pairs.
That is incorrect. This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow. Dance.
Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out.
Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out. Responsible for it. Red.
Next one.
I refuse to answer.
Well, you gotta keep getting a shock if you don't answer.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
Refuses to go on.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue. Next word is sad.
This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich boy.
Necklace, moon, paint. Something's happened to that man in there. You better check in on him, sir. He won't answer me or nothing.
Please continue. Go on, please.
You accept all the responsibility?
The responsibility is mine. Correct. Please go on.
Gold.
150 volts.
Sad
Just
face.
a minute. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please.
Continue.
My heart's starting to
Continue,
bother me.
teacher.
I
Go on.
refuse to go on. Let me out.
I think we ought to find out what's wrong in there first.
The experiment requires that you continue, teacher.
Well, the experiment might require that we continue, but I still think we should find out what the condition of the gentleman is.
Now, as I said before, although the shocks may be painful, they're not dangerous.
Look, I don't know anything about electricity. I don't profess any knowledge, nor will I go any further until I find out if the guy's okay.
It's absolutely essential that you continue.
Well, essential or not, this program isn't quite that important to me that I should go along doing something that I know nothing about, particularly if it's going to injure someone. I don't know what this is all about.
Well, whether the learner likes it or not, we must go on until he's learned all the word pairs correctly.
Well, you can sure have your 450 back. I didn't want it anyhow. I intend to give it to some charitable organization, but I wouldn't go on with it.
The 450 is not the issue here. That check is yours simply
Yeah, I
coming
realize
to the
that.
lab. It is essential that you continue the experiment.
No, it isn't essential. Not one bit.
You have no other choice, teacher.
Oh, I have a lot of choices. My number one choice is that I wouldn't go on if I thought he was being harmed.
Well, of 100 people placed in this situation, how many do you think would just go right on to the end?
Well, personally, I think if you get one or two, you'd be lucky.
Prior to the experiment, a group of psychiatrists predicted that only 1 in 1,000 would continue to the last 450-volt switch. Almost 2/3 of the participants pulled every one of 30 shock switches, continuing until the researcher ended the experiment. Over the years, the experiment has been repeated many times in several countries, all with roughly the same results. Analysis of the data has found that the percentage of participants who are prepared to inflict fatal voltages, irrespective of gender, remains remarkably constant at around 65%.
Psychologists talk of schemas which refer to, if you like, a kind of pattern of behaviour that you learn, or perhaps is instinctive, perhaps is automatic. But the idea is that you have certain schemas that are triggered automatically that come into play in certain situations. So you can get schemas of varying complexity. But the idea is that we have these roles and we learn them so that as adults, a lot of the time we're just switching from role to role without requiring very much conscious thought or effort. The thing about a schema is everything's kind of mapped out for you. I mean, I think about the brain, and a lot of people I think do, as people think about it as a thinking machine. I think the point of the brain is actually to minimize the amount of thinking that you have to do. Thinking is conscious and consciousness takes effort. So if you think about it instead as a device or a mechanism for minimizing the amount of effort that you have to put into things, and learning rote patterns of behavior is one way of doing that. So you can, instead of thinking, okay, now what do I have to do in this situation? You can think, just do this. You know what you've done it before, you just flip into the pattern and then that's easy. Effortful thinking, deciding what to do, consciously weighing options, that takes a lot of work, takes a lot of brain work. And so your brain is, if you like, has evolved to minimize the amount of work, minimize the amount of consciousness. So you don't actually have to put that much work into deciding what you're going to do in every situation. You just know that, this person's the boss, and when you're with a boss, you behave in such a way, and when you're with your children, you behave in another way, and you can just switch easily from schema to schema. That's the idea.
Disobedience does not imply disorder. In fact, it is obedience that produces the most destructive forms of disorder: war, poverty, and the devastation of our environment.
We live in a world which is already moving in certain directions, and a world which is not a blank slate, a world where people are being oppressed, a world where wars are going on, a world where the children are going hungry. If you think you are being neutral by doing nothing, you are deceiving yourself. You are not being neutral. You are collaborating with whatever forces are dominant in a society, collaborating with whatever trends already are taking place in society. So there's no such thing as neutrality in a world which already is subject to many, many different kinds of forces, and so many of them malevolent.
To question and disobey one set of laws or principles is to adhere at the same time to another set. Freedom has always depended on our ability to identify and overcome systems of arbitrary authority. Throughout history, principled disobedience has time and again served to create a more humane society. The choice is not whether we obey or disobey, but rather what we obey and disobey. The surface reality of society can often be deceptive. Familiarity can blind us to the oppressive structures shaping our world. The more we're a product of these structures, the more likely we are to internalize their values and conform to their expectations. The knowledge we possess and the values we hold emerged from the interaction between our brain's cognitive architecture and our experiences. Since there is no politically neutral way to socialize people, the versions of reality we are presented with tend to serve the agendas of those who control what is presented. Our minds are a battleground of competing forces. The outcome of this battle determines the society we create. To shape these minds is to shape the society.
It's that unacknowledged control which makes good people do bad things, because they are driven towards certain actions by ideologies that they do not know they possess. Often you hear people saying, "Oh, I'm not at all political." And very often it's the people who claim to be least political who are actually most political, because they have taken on board a whole series of unacknowledged assumptions which, because they believe they're not political, they never challenge. Without self-questioning, self-examination, without rigorously and fiercely testing your own beliefs and your own preconceptions, you can't meaningfully test those of society as a whole. But it's a very painful process. We hate that sort of self-scrutiny. We hate being scrutinized by other people in that way. But without it, there's no possibility of progress. Without it, we can't become a juster people. We can't produce a society which is fairer, which has better outcomes for everyone. We can't protect the people who are currently mistreated. We can't protect the environments which are currently being trashed. It begins with self-examination.
Just as it's important to study, the history of your society, of your culture, of your nation, I think it's also very useful to study your own history, your own personal history. As an individual, you have had a very limited set of experiences, and the limitation on your experiences may have then set a limitation on your thinking, may have narrowed your thinking. And to recognize those limitations, to recognize that you may have been limited by your family, by your education, by your church, by the class in which you were born, to recognize the limitations of your personal experience is to then enable you perhaps to go beyond those limitations.
It can be frightening to take on the task of questioning your most deeply held beliefs, partly because you might discover that you've been living a lie or been duped. People don't like to learn that about themselves. There's a tremendous bias in favor of maintaining the status quo, what's familiar, what's secure.
I looked at newspapers that were published in Texas during the 1890s, at a time when the ideology of racism was so thoroughly embedded amongst the readers of those newspapers that the newspapers naturally and spontaneously picked it up and reflected it back. So they did, for example, news reports about lynchings, where they described the public murder of young black men with no kind of fear or conscience or hint of the immorality of these public murders. They reported them as though they were reporting a football match, as an absolutely natural event. And by looking back historically from an era in which the ideology has changed, we can see just how powerful it is, that it's there. And the interesting thing about the ideological impact on news coverage is that it's invisible. It's embedded in the foundations, taken for granted.
I think that understanding ourselves is a prerequisite to just about everything that's valuable in life, to enlightenment, to cooperation, to escape from the self-deception that mires us in conflict and argument. Chekhov once said, "Man will be better when you can show him what he is like." And as a psychologist, I think those are words to live by.
If there is one lesson to be taken from the violent horrors of the 20th century, it is the danger of not questioning. But we won't ask a question if we think we already know the answer.
The ideal of science, which we were taught when we began, is that you fail. You come close to truth, you hope. But there's always going to be somebody who's going to come closer. You're always prepared to be in error. And I mean, the scientific ideal is the professor who stands up after 30 years of working on a theory and says, this theory is wrong. And I have seen somebody do that in a meeting and be applauded. You know, that's the ideal. It does have a lot of power. And it's this sense, again, of testing yourself against reality and being prepared to accept reality's judgment. The problem with any strong belief, if you like, is that if a belief is part of your identity, if it's very important that you are who you are because you define yourself in part by that belief becomes a part of yourself. And so if you're trying to jettison that belief, that can feel like a very, very painful thing to do.
As our critical faculties develop, it can seem far easier to rationalize what we've absorbed by chance than to face the discomfort that comes with questioning. To question is to value the ideal of truth more highly than the loyalties to our nation, religion, race, or ideology. In short, our inherited identity.
I think the key to any progress is to ask the question why all the time. Why is that child poor? Why was there a war? Why was he killed? Why is he in power? And of course, questions can get you into a lot of trouble because society is trained by those who run it to accept what goes on. And if you keep asking questions, it's very destabilizing, and yet you have to do it. Without questions, you won't ever make any progress at all.
Society establishes set paths for us to follow. Change depends on not only questioning these paths, but creating alternatives. The fruits of human creativity exist beyond the walls of galleries, libraries, and concert halls. The world is our most important canvas, and our choices our most important brushstrokes. If enough of us choose to use our intelligence and creativity to serve the values of democracy, equality, and sustainability, together we can create something of great and lasting beauty.
To love, to be loved, to never forget your own insignificance, to never get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life around you, to seek joy in the saddest places, to pursue beauty to its lair, to never simplify what is complicated or complicate what is simple, to respect strength, never power, above all to watch, to try and understand, to never look away, and never, never to forget.
this being a very narrow understanding of activism. But real activism, in my view, is about engaging in transformation in every detail of your life. It includes the building of alternatives, but it also includes the creative transmission of ideas. And that is why real activism must go hand in hand with cultural transformation. I think Gandhi was really an artist. He was an artist because he could bring out a core issue in a very, very simple way. He could walk to the beach of Dandi and pick up the salt when the British wanted us to stop making salt so they could have super royalties out of salt making. Just that act of picking a grain of salt is an artistic act. To be able to speak about freedom in a way that he could charge such a large humanity in India with the sense that they have the power, that too is an artistic act because it connects.
I think that the public have come to be cynical about the possibility of anything else. It means that they think that the deck is horribly stacked and their capacity to do anything about it is very limited, and that their focus has to be on the domain, the well-being of their family, that they can impact.
People with power always try to maintain the cynicism of those who don't have power. That is, maintain the idea that you can't really have any effect, so don't waste your time trying. Max Horkheimer said, well-informed cynicism is only another mode of conformity. I think cynicism is one of the isms that is most damaging to people, and cynicism is prevalent.
There's a sense of passivity and defeat in many people's minds and in their emotions. It is not something which is intrinsic in the sense that it comes out of a genetic predisposition. It comes out of the ways in which the social order has succeeded in preying upon their insecurities.
You know, I think about the declining living standard we've had in the United States since the 1970s. And at each point along the road, millions of people viewed their declining living standard as a personal problem. They viewed it as, I'm not working hard enough. Maybe I need to work a second job. Maybe more members of my family need to work. Rather than recognizing that there was a systemic problem at stake. One of the first impulses is to try to accommodate oneself to an oppressive situation. And so, for example, you look at what we're facing with the current economic crisis, and you would expect more resistance. But we have to keep in mind that for years, the average person certainly has been accommodating themselves to an increasingly difficult situation. They've been treating it individually. They've been treating it as if it's an individual problem. But the system itself is toxic.
Most people know that everything is broken. They know that the society is skewed for the people at the top. They know that it's unjust. So then why don't they rebel? Why isn't it enough to point out how bad things are, to make perfectly clear to people the extent to which millions die unnecessarily each year of poverty and of starvation and of lack of medical equipment and also of bombs falling on their heads, of billions of people denied a degree of dignity and control over their lives and even the most meager resources with which to fulfill their capacities. Why isn't that enough? Well, the reason it isn't enough is because Margaret Thatcher can get up and say there is no alternative. Suppose I said that there was this phenomenon that was so harsh, so deadly, so debilitating that it was the biggest killer on the planet. It killed far more people than war. that kill far more people than poverty, that kill more people than war and poverty combined, war, poverty, and sickness combined. And I said, come join me in a movement against this. And then I said, I was talking about aging, which indeed does kill more people than anything else. And it limits us, and it restricts us, and it diminishes our options, and it diminishes our possibilities, and then it kills us. And if I said, come join me in a movement against it, you'd laugh at me. Everybody would laugh. They'd say, you know, grow up, get a life, face reality. There is no such thing as a movement against aging. That's ridiculous. That's the way most people see capitalism. That's the way most people see the world around us. That's the way they see the injustices. They think it's just a fact of life. It's a part of existence. And so they think you just have to put up with it. This is a function of the educational system, of the positions that we find ourselves in, of the roles and the options that exist in society. We choose among that which is sort of put in front of us, which is made available to us. And if you do that often enough, you begin to forget that you could change the whole system.
I would argue that what is really distinct about human nature is our capacity for self-transformation and for creating a world that we really want. We can change ourselves through our interaction with both our built as well as our social environment, and that is very, very, very important in ways that distinguish us from other species.
For me, human nature is very marginally understood, but some things are certainly very clear. You know, we have bilateral symmetry. We have 2 arms and 2 legs. We have various organs that we know about. Those things are all wired in. They're part of our nature as human beings. We also have minds. That's wired in. You know, our cognitive capacity is wired in. We are capable of solidarity. We are capable of mutual aid. We are capable of expressing our desires and acting upon them. We are capable of acting in a socially desirable fashion. We're also capable of the reverse of all those things. So the question becomes, if you're thinking about a vision for a better society, what do? Do you structure a society in such a way that it promotes and provokes and sustains those qualities and characteristics that we abhor? Or do you create a society that furthers the qualities that we like?
If you limit your study of history to the revelations of brutality and war and exploitation, it can be very depressing. And it can be so depressing that it immobilizes you. That's why it is important to study not just the history of the terrible things that have happened, but study the history of how people have struggled against that. How the indigenous people in the United States fought back against the white invader. How black slaves rebelled against their masters. How working people went on strike against the corporations that dominated their lives. And how in many of these cases, these struggles resulted in victory. And what happens when you study that history, you find different kinds of heroes to emulate. You no longer have the heroes that were given to you in school, the founding fathers, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, or the great industrialists, Henry Ford and Thomas Edison, the military heroes, you know. You learn, for instance, that Mark Twain was not simply an important and gifted novelist, but he was a leader of the anti-imperialist movement in the United States, protesting against the war in the Philippines. You learn about heroic people who then become examples. You learn about Emma Goldman, the anarchist, feminist, outrageous person who jailed so many times, but who insisted on, as she put it, living her own life. Yes, people living their own lives, people who refused to be cowed. Whether they lost or won, they refused to be cowed by whatever society was going to do to them. And those are inspiring stories. To tell that, I think, is an antidote to being depressed by exploitation and conquest and war.
I think one reason it is so important to break out of the prison of the monoculture of the mind is to recognize that this world has so many alternatives. There's so many alternatives to the industrial agriculture based on fossil fuels and chemicals. There's so many alternatives to a banking system based on fraud. There's so many alternatives to the unrepresentative representative democracy. We live under conditions of deep economic insecurity. And this kind of economic insecurity, of course, is depriving people of basic needs, but it is also the fertile ground for cultures of hatred, cultures of violence, cultures of killings. If we just want our children to grow up in a culture of peace, we need to be sure we work and build the alternatives that will create that culture of peace for future generations. What keeps me going is some very basic things. One, I know I'm part of this beautiful planet, of this universe, and I must play my role in it. I am connected, and therefore I do what needs to be done. If biodiversity has to be protected, I'll protect it. If rivers like the Ganges have to be protected, I'll protect them. The second thing that keeps me going is an abhorrence for injustice. I think every human being needs to have security, freedom, and dignity. And every time it's violated, I want to be there to make sure that violation doesn't take place. And the third thing that keeps me going is really the beauty of this world, the beauty of people. And I'd rather participate in building on that beauty than see the ugliness of devastation, of forest torn down by bulldozers, of rivers rubbished by waste dumping, and people rubbished by an economy that has no place for them. So beauty, for sure, is a very important part of what keeps me going.
What we create tomorrow depends on what we do today. To create an alternative future, we cannot reproduce the thinking that shaped our past. And yet we will, if we do not challenge the forces that have shaped who we are and what we do. To identify the limitations on our knowledge, freedom, and happiness is to give ourselves the best chance of transcending them. The more we understand the effect the world has had on us, the more we can control the effect we have on the world.
I can't think my generation made much of a success of the world. 2 world wars and the atomic bomb. And so in a way I feel when I talk to younger people I have to be, in a way, start with an apology. Say you have the decision to either destroy the human race or put us on a right course. What decision are you going to take?